Silence can be louder than violence. In some places across the United States, silence is not peace. It is a weapon used not to punish the body, but to dismantle the mind. Behind reinforced steel doors, under constant fluorescent lighting, and within walls designed to isolate rather than rehabilitate, thousands of men wake up every day inside environments that slowly erase their sense of self. These are not just prisons. These are psychological pressure chambers, places where time stretches endlessly, human contact is rationed, and the mind is left alone to battle itself. The United States operates the largest prison system on Earth. More than 2 million people are incarcerated at any given moment. But hidden beneath the statistics are facilities designed with one unspoken purpose: control through mental collapse. This is not about brutality you can see. This is about damage you cannot. No bruises, no blood, just the slow, invisible breakdown of cognition, emotion, and identity. In these prisons, days blur together. Weeks lose meaning. Months dissolve into a single continuous moment. When the brain is denied stimulation, denied routine human interaction, denied the ability to feel time passing, it begins to turn inward. Thoughts repeat. Memories distort. Anxiety becomes constant. Depression deepens. And eventually, reality itself starts to fracture. Former inmates describe hearing voices in total silence, seeing movement where nothing exists, forgetting how to speak fluently after months without conversation, losing the ability to sleep, or sleeping for 12 hours straight and waking up exhausted. Psychologists have a name for this phenomenon: sensory deprivation, cognitive fragmentation, learned helplessness. But labels do not capture the experience of being trapped alone with your own thoughts for years, sometimes decades, with no end in sight. And this is not accidental. These prisons were engineered, designed, refined. Every hallway, every cell size, every light schedule, every restriction on movement and communication was calculated to produce obedience, submission, and psychological exhaustion. Not to rehabilitate, but to neutralize. Tonight, we are not ranking prisons by escape attempts, riots, or death counts. We are ranking them by something far more disturbing: the ability to break the human mind. Across the United States, there are facilities where isolation is routine, where mental health care is minimal, and where punishment extends far beyond a sentence handed down by a judge. In these places, the mind becomes the battlefield, and the inmate becomes both prisoner and captor. Some of the prisons on this list are infamous. Others operate quietly, far from public attention. All of them share one common trait: people do not leave them the same. This documentary is not about sensationalism. It is about understanding what prolonged psychological stress does to the human brain, and why some systems continue to rely on it. Because the truth is uncomfortable. The mind is not built for isolation. It is built for connection, structure, and purpose. Remove those elements long enough, and even the strongest individuals begin to fracture. Scientists have compared extended solitary confinement to forms of psychological torture, not because of physical pain, but because of its long-term effects on memory, emotional regulation, and perception of reality. Anxiety disorders, chronic paranoia, hallucinations, suicidal ideation, emotional numbness. These effects don't always disappear when someone is released. In many cases, they follow people for the rest of their lives. As you watch this documentary, you will hear stories of inmates who entered the system mentally stable and emerged unable to function in the outside world. Men who forgot what normal conversation felt like, who panicked in open spaces, who could not sleep without lights on, who struggled to reconnect with family because their emotional range had been flattened by years of psychological deprivation. You will also see how these prisons justify their methods in the name of safety, control, and order. But at what cost? And more importantly, how much damage is invisible to the public eye? This ranking is based on psychological intensity, isolation practices, environmental deprivation, and documented mental health outcomes. It is not about fear, it is about reality. Because while bars and walls keep bodies confined, it is the mind that ultimately determines whether someone survives incarceration intact. As we count down the top 7 U.S. prisons that break the human mind, understand this: the most dangerous prisons are not always the loudest. They are the quietest. The ones where nothing happens, day after day, until the mind begins to collapse under the weight of nothingness. And once that process begins, there is no reset button. What you are about to see is not speculation. It is documented. It is systemic. And it is happening right now. This is America's psychological hell. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. At the far northern edge of California, just miles from the Oregon border, there is a prison that does not rely on chaos, violence, or constant confrontation to enforce control. It relies on silence. Pelican Bay State Prison was built in one of the most remote regions of the state, surrounded by dense forests, cold coastal air, and long stretches of emptiness. From the outside, it looks sterile, almost clinical. But buried within its concrete structure is a unit that has become internationally infamous among psychologists, human rights observers, and former inmates alike. The Security Housing Unit, the SHU. This is where the prison system perfected isolation, not as a temporary measure, but as a way of life. For decades, inmates inside Pelican Bay's SHU were held in near total solitary confinement for 22 to 24 hours a day. Not for days, not for weeks, for years, some for decades. No meaningful human contact, no group programs, no shared meals, no touch. The cell itself is small, just large enough to pace a few steps forward, a few steps back. Solid concrete walls on all sides, a solid steel door, a narrow slot for food, and a light that rarely turns off. There are no windows to the outside world, no way to track the passage of time, and no reliable sense of day or night. For many inmates, the only outdoor experience comes in the form of a concrete exercise yard, often described as a dog run, where prisoners are allowed to stand alone, enclosed by walls so high they block any view of the horizon. Even the sky is rationed. This is not accidental design. Pelican Bay's SHU was created during a period when prison officials believed extreme isolation was the most effective way to control inmates labeled as gang-affiliated or disruptive. Placement in the SHU did not require a new criminal conviction. It often relied on confidential informants, alleged associations, or possession of certain drawings, books, or symbols. Once inside, release was uncertain. Some inmates were told the only way out was to debrief, to provide information about gangs, real or perceived. For many, that choice carried life-threatening consequences. For others, it was impossible. So they stayed, and the mind began to change. Psychologists who later studied former SHU inmates found consistent patterns of psychological deterioration. Anxiety became constant. Paranoia intensified. Memory weakened. Concentration fractured. Many inmates reported becoming hypersensitive to sound or terrified of complete silence. Some lost the ability to engage in basic conversation. Others described feeling emotionally hollow, unable to experience joy, sadness, or empathy. This condition has a name: social death. When humans are deprived of meaningful interaction long enough, the brain begins to shut down systems it no longer sees as necessary. Language processing weakens. Emotional regulation collapses. The mind adapts, not to survive, but to endure. In the SHU, time does not heal. It erodes. Former inmates describe pacing their cells for hours, talking to themselves just to hear a human voice, even if it was their own. Some counted footsteps. Some memorized cracks in the walls. Others developed strict mental routines to avoid losing control. But even discipline has limits. One former SHU prisoner described forgetting the faces of his family members after years without visits. Another said he became afraid of eye contact after release because direct human presence felt overwhelming. The irony is this: Pelican Bay was designed to neutralize danger, but in doing so, it created a different kind of risk, one that followed inmates beyond the prison walls. Studies have shown that individuals released directly from long-term solitary confinement face higher rates of mental illness, homelessness, and reincarceration. The mind, once conditioned to isolation, struggles to function in a world full of noise, unpredictability, and social demands. For many, freedom itself becomes destabilizing. What makes Pelican Bay particularly disturbing is not just the isolation, but its duration and normalization. Solitary confinement was not an emergency measure. It was routine, institutionalized. justified through policy language that framed psychological deprivation as management. Over time, the SHU became less about behavior and more about identity. Once labeled, inmates found it nearly impossible to escape the system. Public attention eventually reached Pelican Bay after years of hunger strikes, lawsuits, and international scrutiny. Inmates starved themselves not for comfort, but for recognition, for acknowledgement that what was happening to them mattered, that the mind has limits. Reforms came slowly. Some conditions changed. Some inmates were transferred. But the legacy of the SHU remains embedded in the psychological history of American incarceration. Pelican Bay demonstrated something the system was not prepared to confront. You do not need physical brutality to break a person. You only need time, silence, and isolation. This is why Pelican Bay ranks at number 7 on this list. Not because it is the most extreme prison in the United States, but because it proved a concept, that the human mind can be dismantled quietly, methodically, legally. And once that door was opened, other institutions pushed the boundaries even further. As we move deeper into this ranking, the environments will become more restrictive, the isolation more absolute, the psychological consequences more severe. Pelican Bay was not the end point. It was the beginning. There is a place in the United States prison system where isolation is not a consequence. It is the foundation. Hidden in the high desert of southern Colorado, surrounded by mountains and emptiness, stands a facility so controlled, so psychologically restrictive, that it has earned a reputation unlike any other prison in the country. ADX Florence. Often described as the most secure prison in America, ADX Florence was designed with one singular objective: absolute control. Not just over movement, not just over behavior, but over perception itself. From the moment an inmate arrives at ADX, the rules of normal reality begin to dissolve. This is not a place where prisoners interact freely, form routines together, or experience even the illusion of community. Instead, each individual is sealed into a self-contained psychological environment, one that minimizes unpredictability, emotion, and human presence. Cells at ADX Florence are approximately the size of a standard parking space. They are constructed almost entirely of poured concrete, bed, desk, stool, and walls fused into a single, immovable structure. The door is solid steel. The window, if it can be called that, is a narrow slit designed to show only sky. No horizon, no landmarks, no reference points. This design is intentional. Without visual anchors, the brain struggles to orient itself in space and time. Days begin to blur. Seasons become irrelevant. The outside world becomes abstract, something remembered rather than experienced. Inmates at ADX Florence spend up to 23 hours a day alone in these cells. Meals are passed through a slot. Recreation, when permitted, occurs in isolation. Movement is tightly choreographed. Communication between prisoners is minimized to the point of near elimination. Even sound is controlled. The facility is engineered to prevent echoes, reducing the ability to hear other human beings. Shouting is pointless. Conversation is impossible. Silence becomes the dominant sensory input. And silence, when sustained long enough, is not neutral. It is destabilizing. Psychologists describe the human brain as a prediction machine, constantly interpreting signals from the environment to understand what is happening, what comes next, and how to respond. At ADX Florence, those signals are stripped away. There are no social cues, no spontaneous interactions, no meaningful changes. The brain is left with nothing to process but itself. For some inmates, this results in extreme introspection. Thoughts loop endlessly. Regrets replay. Fears amplify. For others, the mind attempts to create stimulation where none exists, leading to hallucinations, intrusive thoughts, and distorted perceptions of reality. Former prisoners have described hearing voices that were not there, feeling watched even when alone, losing the ability to distinguish between dreams and waking life. Sleep becomes irregular. Some inmates sleep excessively to escape consciousness. Others develop chronic insomnia, unable to relax in an environment of constant control and artificial lighting. One of the most damaging aspects of ADX Florence is the absence of uncertainty, paradoxically, not its presence. Every movement is scheduled. Every action is regulated. Every day is nearly identical to the last. This kind of predictability might sound stabilizing, but over time it has the opposite effect. Without variation, the brain loses its sense of progression. There is no before or after, only an endless present. This phenomenon is known as temporal disintegration. When time stops feeling linear, motivation collapses. Goals lose meaning. Hope becomes abstract. The future feels unreachable, not because it is frightening, but because it feels unreal. ADX Florence does not rely on physical violence to enforce compliance. It relies on psychological inevitability. Resistance feels pointless when nothing changes. And that is where the breakdown begins. Mental health professionals who have reviewed conditions at ADX Florence have raised concerns for years. Anxiety disorders, severe depression, cognitive decline, emotional flattening, increased risk of self-harm. But perhaps the most disturbing effect is something less visible. Identity erosion. Humans define themselves through interaction, through how others respond to them. In an environment where interaction is almost entirely absent, identity begins to dissolve. Prisoners report feeling less like people and more like objects being stored. Over time, language skills deteriorate. Emotional expression weakens. The ability to relate to others fades. This becomes especially dangerous for inmates who eventually leave ADX Florence. Release does not reverse the damage. Former inmates have described panic attacks triggered by open spaces, difficulty processing noise, overwhelming anxiety in crowds, inability to hold conversations without becoming mentally exhausted. The world becomes too loud, too fast, too unpredictable. ADX Florence was designed to contain individuals considered too dangerous for any other prison. But its psychological impact extends far beyond the walls of the facility. It raises an uncomfortable question. If a system produces long-term psychological harm as a standard outcome, can it still be considered purely corrective? Supporters argue that ADX Florence is necessary, that it protects staff, other inmates, and the public. And in some cases, that may be true. But necessity does not eliminate consequence. The reality is this. ADX Florence demonstrates what happens when control becomes absolute, when the human mind is treated as something to be managed rather than understood. It is not chaos that breaks people here. It is order. Total, unyielding, inescapable order. This is why ADX Florence ranks higher than Pelican Bay on this list. Pelican Bay proved isolation could dismantle the mind. ADX Florence refined the process. And as we move further into this ranking, you will see facilities where isolation becomes even more severe, where the psychological impact is faster, deeper, and in some cases, irreversible. The descent has only begun. Some prisons destroy the mind through silence. Others do it through chaos. Rikers Island belongs firmly in the second category. Floating in the East River between Queens and the Bronx, Rikers Island is not a distant, hidden Supermax buried in the desert. It sits within sight of one of the largest cities on Earth, surrounded by millions of people going about their daily lives. And yet, psychologically, it may be one of the most destabilizing correctional environments in the United States. Because Rikers does not rely on isolation alone. It relies on constant psychological overload. Rikers Island is not a single jail, but a sprawling complex of facilities that primarily houses people who have not yet been convicted of a crime. Many are awaiting trial. Some cannot afford bail. Others are there for minor charges. Legally, they are presumed innocent. Mentally, many do not survive unchanged. Unlike long-term prisons where routine becomes rigid and predictable, Rikers operates in a state of perpetual instability. Inmates are transferred frequently. Housing units change without warning. Guards rotate constantly. Rules shift depending on staffing, tension levels, and overcrowding. There is no psychological ground to stand on. For the human brain, unpredictability is more damaging than hardship. When the mind cannot anticipate what comes next, it remains locked in a state of hypervigilance, a survival mode meant to be temporary. At Rikers, that mode becomes permanent. Noise is relentless. Shouting echoes through corridors day and night. Doors slam. Arguments erupt without warning. Alarms trigger suddenly. Sleep is fragmented, shallow, and irregular. Inmates describe nights where they never fully fall asleep, drifting in and out of consciousness while remaining alert for threats. This constant partial wakefulness erodes cognitive function over time, impairing memory, judgment, and emotional control. Violence at Rikers is not always explosive. Often, it is ambient, a constant undercurrent of tension that never fully releases. Psychologists refer to this as chronic stress exposure, and its effects on the brain are profound. Cortisol levels remain elevated. The nervous system never resets. Emotional responses become exaggerated or completely numb. In this environment, even minor conflicts feel existential. Add to this the overcrowding. Rikers has long operated beyond capacity, forcing inmates into cramped housing units with little personal space. Privacy does not exist. Every movement is observed. Every interaction is potentially confrontational. This creates what mental health professionals call social threat saturation, a state where the brain perceives danger everywhere, even when none is immediately present. Under these conditions, the mind begins to fracture. Anxiety disorders skyrocket. Depression deepens. Paranoia becomes rational behavior. Emotional regulation collapses. Small frustrations trigger extreme reactions. For individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions, Rikers can be catastrophic, and many inmates arrive already vulnerable. Rikers Island houses one of the largest jail-based mental health populations in the country. Yet treatment resources are chronically overstretched. Therapy sessions are inconsistent. Medication management is unstable. Continuity of care is often broken by sudden transfers or lockdowns. The result is a system where psychological deterioration is not only common, it is expected. Inmates with mental illness are frequently placed in restrictive housing as punishment for behaviors directly related to their conditions. Instead of treatment, they receive confinement. Instead of stability, they receive discipline. This creates a feedback loop. Mental illness leads to infractions. Infractions lead to harsher conditions. Harsher conditions worsen mental illness, and the cycle repeats. One of the most damaging psychological aspects of Rikers is uncertainty. In long-term prisons, inmates know their sentence. They can count years. They can measure time. At Rikers, many inmates do not know when their case will move forward. Court dates are postponed. Paperwork is delayed. Legal representation is inconsistent. Days turn into months with no clear resolution. This kind of uncertainty attacks the mind differently. Hope cannot attach itself to a timeline. The future becomes vague and threatening. The brain struggles to cope with the absence of structure. Some inmates report becoming emotionally detached as a survival mechanism, shutting down feelings to endure the constant stress. Others become increasingly volatile, unable to regulate anger or fear. Self-harm rates at Rikers have historically been among the highest in the nation, not because inmates want to die, but because they want the psychological pain to stop. Rikers Island demonstrates a critical truth about incarceration. You do not need isolation to destroy the mind. You only need instability, fear, and neglect. The mind cannot rest here. It cannot adapt. It cannot normalize the environment. Every day demands vigilance. Every interaction carries risk. And for inmates eventually released, often without conviction, the damage does not disappear. Former detainees describe lingering anxiety, hypervigilance, and difficulty sleeping long after leaving Rikers. Some struggle to reintegrate into normal social environments. Crowds feel threatening. Authority figures trigger fear responses. Silence feels unfamiliar. Rikers does not just punish the body. It rewires the brain. This is why Rikers Island ranks higher than ADX Florence on this list. ADX dismantles the mind through silence and control. Rikers does it through chaos and overload. Both are devastating. But Rikers is particularly dangerous because it affects people at the very beginning of their contact with the justice system, before guilt is determined, before sentences are imposed, before the mind has any chance to prepare. As we move further into this ranking, the environments will grow even more extreme. The psychological damage more concentrated. The margin for recovery narrower. The next prisons on this list do not rely on chaos or silence alone. They combine both. Some prisons break the mind quickly. Others do it slowly. So slowly that the damage feels invisible while it is happening. Angola belongs to the second category. Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly known as Angola, is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. It sits on 18,000 acres of former plantation land, bordered on three sides by the Mississippi River. Its isolation is geographic, historical, and psychological. Angola is not just a prison. It is a self-contained world. More than 5,000 inmates live here, many serving life sentences with no possibility of parole. For a significant portion of the population, release is not a realistic outcome. The future does not include freedom. It includes only endurance. And that changes everything about how the mind functions. At Angola, the psychological weight does not come from extreme isolation or constant chaos. It comes from permanence. From the moment inmates arrive, they are confronted with a truth that most prison systems avoid stating openly. This is where you will grow old. This is where you will die. Psychologically, the human brain is built to endure suffering when it believes there is an end point. Even distant hope can stabilize the mind. But when hope is removed entirely, the brain must adapt in more destructive ways. Angola forces that adaptation. Daily life at Angola is defined by routine, labor, and repetition. Inmates work in fields under the Louisiana sun, maintaining farmland, roads, and infrastructure that keep the prison running. The schedule is rigid. Days blend together. Years lose distinction. This kind of repetition creates what psychologists call existential erosion. Not stress, not fear, but a slow loss of meaning. When every day looks the same, the brain struggles to justify emotional investment. Motivation declines. Curiosity fades. Emotional range narrows. Over time, many inmates report feeling less like active participants in life and more like passive observers of time passing. This is not an accident. Angola was designed to be self-sustaining. Inmates grow food. Inmates maintain buildings. Inmates enforce social order within housing units. The system relies heavily on inmate labor and inmate hierarchy. And that hierarchy carries its own psychological cost. Violence at Angola is not constant, but it is embedded. It exists as an understood possibility. Power dynamics among inmates are shaped by sentence length, physical strength, alliances, and reputation. Those serving life sentences often hold informal authority. Younger inmates quickly learn that resistance is dangerous and that submission is sometimes safer than confrontation. This creates a culture of adaptive suppression, where individuals learn to silence parts of themselves to survive. Over time, emotional expression becomes liability. Vulnerability becomes weakness. Empathy becomes risky. The mind hardens, not because it wants to, but because it must. Mental health professionals who have studied long-term incarceration consistently report similar outcomes: emotional flattening, dissociation, chronic depression, and identity fragmentation. At Angola, these effects are magnified by the sheer length of confinement. Decades without meaningful change alter how the brain processes reality. Inmates describe losing track of major life events outside prison walls. Parents die. Siblings age. Children grow up without them. The outside world becomes something they hear about, not something they belong to. This produces a phenomenon known as psychological exile. Even before death, individuals begin to grieve their own absence from society. Religion plays a significant role at Angola, not only as faith, but as psychological survival. Many inmates turn to religious structure to replace the meaning that has been stripped away by endless incarceration. Services, rituals, and belief systems offer a framework where time and suffering can be interpreted as purposeful. But even faith has limits. For inmates without strong belief systems, the absence of future milestones creates emotional stagnation. There is nothing to work toward except another day survived. Some adapt by detaching completely. Others internalize anger that has nowhere to go. And some simply disappear psychologically, physically present, mentally withdrawn. One of the most damaging aspects of Angola is not violence or deprivation. It is normalization of hopelessness. When everyone around you expects to die in prison, despair becomes cultural. It is passed down through conversations, warnings, and silence. New inmates absorb it quickly. The brain learns that planning is pointless. That emotional investment is dangerous. That attachment only increases pain. This mindset can keep someone alive inside Angola, but it destroys them as a person. Former inmates who manage to leave after decades describe overwhelming difficulty adjusting to freedom. The outside world feels chaotic. Choice feels burdensome. Open-ended possibilities create anxiety rather than excitement. Some experience guilt for surviving when others did not. Others feel emotionally disconnected from family members who have lived full lives without them. Angola does not rely on extreme punishment to break the mind. It relies on time. Time without hope. Time without change. Time without future. That is why Angola ranks higher than Rikers Island on this list. Rikers destroys the mind through chaos and neglect. Angola does it through permanence and resignation. Both are devastating. But Angola's psychological damage is slower, deeper, and often irreversible. As we move toward the top of this ranking, the environments will become more extreme, not necessarily louder, not necessarily more violent, but more psychologically absolute. The next prisons do not just remove hope. They actively dismantle identity. Some prisons rely on chaos to dominate the mind. Others rely on time. A few rely on isolation. USP Marion relies on something far more devastating: total behavioral control. Located in southern Illinois, United States Penitentiary Marion was not originally intended to become one of the most psychologically damaging prisons in American history. But after a series of violent incidents in the early 1980s, the facility underwent a transformation that would quietly reshape the entire federal prison system. Marion became the prototype, the testing ground, the place where the concept of permanent lockdown was normalized. After 2 correctional officers were killed in separate incidents, federal authorities imposed an unprecedented response. Instead of temporary restrictions, the prison was placed under indefinite lockdown. Inmates were confined to their cells for nearly the entire day. Movement was eliminated. Programs were suspended. Social interaction was reduced to near zero. And then something remarkable happened. The lockdown never ended. For years, inmates at USP Marion lived under conditions that would later be recognized as extreme isolation, not as punishment for individual behavior, but as a default state of existence. This marked a psychological turning point in American incarceration. Marion proved that you could run a prison almost entirely through restriction. And once proven, the model spread. Inside Marion, cells became the entire universe. Inmates spent up to 23 hours a day alone, emerging only for tightly controlled movement or isolated recreation. Human contact was minimal. Conversations were shouted through doors or whispered through vents. The silence was not peaceful. It was enforced. What separates Marion from earlier forms of solitary confinement is not just duration, but permanence. There was no clear path out, no behavioral ladder, no incentive structure that restored normalcy. This created a psychological condition far more damaging than fear. Learn helplessness. When individuals are placed in environments where their actions have no meaningful impact on outcomes, the brain eventually stops trying. Motivation collapses. Initiative disappears. Emotional response dulls. Not because the person becomes weak, but because the brain adapts to conserve energy. At Marion, inmates learned that compliance did not restore privileges. Good behavior did not change conditions. Time did not lead to progress. Nothing did. This breaks a fundamental psychological contract, the belief that effort matters. Once that belief is gone, the mind enters a survival mode defined by emotional withdrawal and passivity. Prisoners stop planning, stop hoping, stop imagining futures. They exist. Former inmates describe this state as being mentally frozen. Thoughts slow. Memory becomes unreliable. Emotional reactions flatten. The ability to feel urgency fades. Even anger becomes exhausting. This is not peace. It is shutdown. Mental health evaluations conducted years later found alarmingly consistent symptoms among former Marion inmates: chronic depression, anxiety disorders, impaired concentration, emotional numbness, and difficulty making decisions long after release. Decision-making becomes particularly difficult. In an environment where choice is eliminated entirely, the brain loses its ability to prioritize, evaluate, and commit. Even simple decisions, what to eat, where to sit, what to do next, become overwhelming. Freedom becomes stressful. One former prisoner described being unable to choose items in a grocery store without panic. Another said open spaces felt threatening because his brain had adapted to narrow, controlled environments. This is the psychological cost of total control. USP Marion also played a critical role in redefining how the federal system viewed dangerousness. Instead of addressing individual behavior, Marion institutionalized the idea that entire populations could be managed through restriction. Risk was assumed. And when risk is assumed, deprivation becomes justified. The success of Marion's lockdown, measured not by mental health outcomes but by the absence of violence, convinced policymakers that extreme control worked. But it worked at a cost that was not immediately visible. Because psychological damage does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly. Marion inmates often described losing track of personal identity. Without roles, responsibilities, or relationships, the self begins to erode. People stop seeing themselves as fathers, sons, brothers, workers, or thinkers. They become inmates. And eventually, they become numbers. This erosion of identity is one of the most severe forms of psychological harm. When individuals no longer recognize themselves as complex human beings, empathy fades, both toward others and toward themselves. Self-care becomes irrelevant. The future feels fictional. USP Marion did not need violence to enforce obedience. It needed inevitability. The knowledge that nothing you do matters. That resistance changes nothing. That compliance changes nothing. That time changes nothing. This realization settles slowly, then completely. And once it does, the mind reshapes itself around endurance alone. Marion ranks higher than Angola on this list because it represents a shift from punishment to psychological management. Angola removes hope through time. Marion removes agency itself. Angola tells inmates they will never leave. Marion tells them that even inside, they have no control. This distinction matters. Because when agency is removed, recovery becomes far more difficult, even after release. Marion was eventually replaced and functioned by newer facilities designed with even more advanced isolation strategies. But its legacy lives on. It taught the system how to break resistance without force, how to silence through structure, how to dominate the mind without leaving visible scars. As we move toward the final entries on this list, we are approaching prisons that do not just control behavior or eliminate hope. They actively dismantle the sense of self. And once that happens, the damage is often permanent. Some prisons dismantle the mind through chaos, others through silence, some through time. Tams Correctional Center dismantled the mind through total sensory and social erasure. Before it closed, Tams was widely regarded by mental health experts, legal scholars, and former inmates as one of the most psychologically extreme prisons ever operated in the United States. It was not large. It was not old. It was not overcrowded. It was precise. Tams was built with one purpose: to isolate. Not temporarily, not selectively, but completely. Located in a remote area of southern Illinois, Tams housed a relatively small population of inmates, all classified as the most difficult, dangerous, or disruptive within the state system. But what made Tams unique was not who was sent there. It was how long they stayed, and what happened to them while they did. At Tams, inmates were confined to their cells 23 to 24 hours a day, often for years at a time. The cells were stark, concrete walls, a concrete bed, a steel door, and minimal furnishings. Windows were small or non-existent. Natural light was limited. Artificial light dominated the environment. There was no meaningful human contact, no group programs, no communal meals, no shared recreation. Movement outside the cell was rare, brief, and conducted in full restraints. For the human brain, this level of deprivation is not neutral. It is destabilizing. Tams removed nearly every external reference point that allows the mind to orient itself in reality. Social interaction, gone. Environmental variation, gone. Physical autonomy, gone. Time markers, distorted. When the brain is deprived of stimulation for extended periods, it does not remain idle. It turns inward. Thoughts loop endlessly. Memories replay without resolution. Fears magnify. The mind searches for meaning where none exists. And when it cannot find it, it begins to create it. Former Tams inmates described experiencing hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing movement in empty cells, feeling presences that were not there. Others reported severe paranoia, convinced they were being watched even in complete isolation. Sleep became fragmented and irregular. Some inmates slept excessively, using unconsciousness as an escape. Others developed chronic insomnia, unable to relax in an environment of constant surveillance and restriction. Psychologists refer to this as sensory deprivation syndrome. and its effects can be profound and long-lasting. Cognitive functions decline. Memory weakens. Attention spans shorten. Emotional regulation collapses. The ability to plan, reflect, and self-monitor deteriorates. But perhaps the most damaging effect of TAMS was not what inmates experienced, but what they lost: the sense of being a social being. Humans are wired to exist in relation to others. Identity is shaped by interaction, feedback, and recognition. When those elements are removed entirely, the self begins to dissolve. Inmates at TAMS described feeling as though they were slowly disappearing, not physically, but psychologically. Days lost meaning. Weeks blurred together. Years passed without milestones. Without interaction, language skills degraded. Emotional expression weakened. Some inmates reported difficulty forming complete sentences after years of near-total silence. This is not adaptation. It is erosion. One of the most disturbing aspects of TAMS was the absence of progression. In many prison systems, even restrictive housing includes a pathway back to general population, behavior-based steps that restore limited privileges. At TAMS, that pathway was often unclear or non-existent. Inmates did not know what actions would improve their conditions, or if improvement was even possible. This uncertainty destroys motivation. When the brain cannot link behavior to outcome, it disengages. Effort feels pointless. Resistance feels futile. Compliance feels meaningless. This psychological state is known as institutional hopelessness, a condition in which individuals stop believing that the future can be influenced at all. Under these conditions, emotional collapse becomes common. Depression deepens. Anxiety becomes constant. Suicidal ideation increases. Self-harm becomes a method of control, one of the few remaining ways inmates feel they can influence their environment. TAMS did not need violence to enforce obedience. It relied on inevitability. The knowledge that tomorrow would look exactly like today, and the day after that, with no end in sight. Mental health professionals repeatedly warned that TAMS was producing severe psychological harm. Lawsuits documented widespread mental illness among inmates who entered the facility without prior diagnoses. Some prisoners arrived stable. They did not leave that way. Even after TAMS closed, the damage followed former inmates into the outside world. Many struggled with basic social interaction. Crowds triggered panic. Open spaces felt overwhelming. Decision-making caused anxiety. Freedom itself felt dangerous. TAMS ranks higher than USP Marion because it took the lessons of permanent lockdown and pushed them further, removing not just agency, but reality anchors. Marion taught the system how to eliminate control. TAMS taught it how to eliminate context. And when context disappears, the mind has nothing to hold on to. Identity fractures. Perception distorts. Reality itself becomes unstable. This is why TAMS stands at rank number 2. Because it demonstrated that you do not need physical abuse, chaos, or even long sentences to break the human mind. You only need isolation, complete, prolonged, and absolute. As we move to the final chapter, we reach the prison that surpasses even TAMS. A place where isolation, control, and permanence converge. Where the psychological damage is not a side effect. It is the design. There is a point where incarceration stops being about punishment. A point where it stops being about security. A point where it stops being about control and becomes something else entirely. Red Onion State Prison represents that point. Located in the remote Appalachian region of Western Virginia, Red Onion was built as a modern Supermax facility, newer than the prisons that came before it, more technologically advanced, and more refined in its methods. On paper, it was designed to manage the most dangerous inmates in the state system. In practice, it became one of the most psychologically destructive prisons in the United States. What makes Red Onion different is not simply isolation. It is how completely the prison eliminates every stabilizing reference the human mind depends on. At Red Onion, inmates are confined to their cells for 23 hours a day or more, often for years at a time. Cells are constructed of solid concrete. Furnishings are fixed. Doors are steel. Windows are narrow, if present at all, designed to prevent meaningful views of the outside world. Movement is minimal. Contact is rare. Routine is rigid. But unlike earlier Supermax facilities, Red Onion combines isolation with behavioral uncertainty. Inmates are placed into a multi-level step-down program that, in theory, allows them to earn their way out of extreme isolation. In reality, progress is often opaque, subjective, and inconsistent. This uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a psychological pressure point. When inmates do not understand what is expected of them, or whether improvement is even possible, the mind enters a constant state of evaluation and self-monitoring. Every action feels consequential. Every mistake feels catastrophic. The brain never rests. Psychologists describe this condition as continuous threat assessment, and it is profoundly destabilizing. Unlike chaos, which eventually burns out, or isolation, which numbs over time, uncertainty keeps the nervous system permanently activated. Cortisol remains elevated. Sleep becomes shallow and fragmented. Thoughts race without resolution. Over months and years, this state erodes mental health. Inmates at Red Onion report chronic anxiety, panic attacks, emotional volatility, and severe depression. Many develop symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress, not from a single event, but from prolonged exposure to psychological stress. One of the most damaging aspects of Red Onion is the absence of meaningful human feedback. Humans rely on interaction to regulate behavior, emotion, and identity. A nod, a tone of voice, a facial expression. These cues ground us in reality. At Red Onion, those cues are stripped away. Guards communicate briefly, often through doors. Interactions are transactional. Eye contact is limited. Conversations are discouraged. Without feedback, the mind begins to question itself. Am I behaving normally? Am I overreacting? Am I even real to anyone else? This self-doubt compounds isolation, accelerating identity erosion. Over time, inmates describe feeling less human, more like an object being stored, monitored, and adjusted. This is not metaphor. This is psychological dissociation. Dissociation occurs when the mind detaches from experience as a survival mechanism. Emotions flatten. Memories blur. The present moment feels unreal. At Red Onion, dissociation is not rare. It is common. Mental health professionals have repeatedly warned that long-term confinement under these conditions leads to lasting cognitive impairment. Concentration weakens. Decision-making deteriorates. Emotional regulation collapses. But the most alarming damage is often invisible. Loss of self-narrative. Humans understand themselves through stories. Who they were, who they are, and who they might become. Red Onion disrupts that process entirely. Days blend together without markers. Progress is unclear. The future feels abstract. Without narrative continuity, identity fractures. Inmates stop thinking of themselves as evolving individuals. They exist only in the present moment, managing stress, avoiding punishment, surviving another day. This survival mode is effective inside Red Onion. It is devastating outside it. Former inmates released from Red Onion often struggle profoundly with reintegration. Normal environments feel overwhelming. Choices create anxiety. Social interactions feel draining or threatening. Some report panic attacks triggered by everyday stimuli, crowds, noise, open spaces, or even silence. The brain has been rewired for confinement. Red Onion ranks above every other prison on this list because it represents the most advanced form of psychological incarceration. Pelican Bay proved isolation worked. ADX Florence perfected control. Marion eliminated agency. Tams erased reality anchors. Red Onion combines all of them, isolation, control, uncertainty, and permanence, into a single system. And it does so quietly. There are no riots that make headlines. No constant violence that draws cameras. No obvious spectacle. Just slow, systematic psychological erosion. This is the most dangerous kind of prison, because the damage is difficult to see, difficult to measure, and easy to deny. Red Onion demonstrates a final, unsettling truth about incarceration. You do not need brutality to destroy the human mind. You only need time, isolation, uncertainty, and the removal of meaning. Once those elements are in place, the mind will do the rest. That is why Red Onion State Prison stands at rank number 1. Not because it is the loudest, not because it is the deadliest, but because it is the most psychologically complete. And once the mind breaks at this level, there is often no way back. This was Top 7 U.S. Prisons That Break the Human Mind Inside America's Psychological Hell. What you've just watched is not a collection of isolated cases. It is a pattern. Across different states, different decades, and different prison systems, the same psychological outcomes appear again and again, regardless of geography, policy language, or stated intent. Silence, isolation, uncertainty, control, and time. Together, they form a formula that does something bars and walls alone never could. They rewire the human mind. Throughout this documentary, we ranked prisons not by violence, not by reputation, and not by fear, but by their ability to dismantle something far more fragile and far more important than the body: the sense of self. Because the most lasting damage does not come from physical pain. It comes from environments where meaning disappears, identity erodes, and hope becomes abstract. When the mind loses reference points, when it cannot measure time, interpret human feedback, or imagine a future, it does not simply endure. It changes. And once that change happens, there is no guarantee of reversal. One of the most uncomfortable truths revealed by these prisons is this: the human mind is adaptable, but adaptation is not the same as healing. In isolation, the brain adapts by withdrawing. In chaos, it adapts by becoming hypervigilant. In permanence, it adapts by giving up. These adaptations help people survive incarceration, but they often make survival outside of it far more difficult. This is why so many former inmates describe release not as freedom, but as disorientation. Why crowds feel threatening. Why silence feels unfamiliar. Why simple choices feel overwhelming. The brain has learned a different rule set, and that rule set does not disappear when the doors open. Another difficult reality is that many of the people affected by these systems were not sentenced to psychological destruction. They were sentenced to time. The psychological consequences emerged not because of a judge's words, but because of how incarceration is structured, maintained, and normalized. And this raises a question that rarely gets asked honestly. If a system produces predictable psychological harm as a standard outcome, what responsibility does it bear for the damage it causes? This documentary is not an argument against accountability. It is an argument for awareness. Because ignoring the psychological effects of incarceration does not make society safer. It makes harm invisible. And invisible harm is the easiest kind to repeat. When individuals leave prison with fractured identities, emotional numbness, or chronic fear responses, the consequences extend beyond them. Families feel it. Communities feel it. Social systems feel it. Psychological damage does not stay behind bars. It travels. It shapes behavior. It alters relationships. It influences future decisions. And yet, much of this damage remains undocumented, untreated, and misunderstood. The prisons ranked in this documentary represent the extreme edge of a broader reality, one where psychological pressure is used as a management tool rather than addressed as a risk, where control is prioritized over rehabilitation, where silence is mistaken for stability, where compliance is confused with recovery. But the absence of noise does not mean the absence of suffering. Often, it means the suffering has gone inward. This is why conversations about incarceration must move beyond statistics and slogans, beyond crime rates and sentence lengths. They must include psychology, because the mind is not an afterthought. It is the core of who we are. And systems that systematically damage it do not simply punish individuals. They reshape the future. As viewers, it's easy to distance ourselves from these places. They are far away, hidden, designed to be unseen. But the reality is this: every society is defined not just by how it punishes wrongdoing, but by how it understands human limits. The mind has limits. Isolation has limits. Control has limits. Time has limits. When those limits are ignored, the consequences do not disappear. They accumulate. Silently. This documentary does not claim to have all the answers, but it does ask you to consider a different measure of justice, one that recognizes that the human mind is not indestructible and that survival should not require erasure. If these stories made you uncomfortable, that discomfort matters. It means the subject still has power. It means the damage has not been fully normalized. It means the conversation is not finished. And conversations are where change begins. Because awareness is not sympathy. It is responsibility. Thank you for staying with this documentary from beginning to end. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.